Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Hopefully doing well. We've had plenty of time to, I really, like was mentioned this morning, I enjoy this time we get to speak with one another and kind of fellowship every Sunday. We might not start on time, but who's counting, right? Who's counting? Enjoy this time together. I wanted to bring a lesson to you. I started studying a section of the chapter 2 in 2 Timothy. And started studying it. Then I started, well, we got to get into the context of this, to really grasp what we're talking about. Then I got into the context, and I was like, I'm pretty much covering the whole book. So let's just do some highlight reels. I don't know if you ever watched highlight reels. When I played football, which was a few years ago, and our coach would play highlight reels of people just smacking people. And, this is back when that was still a thing men could do. And watched things like Night Train Lane. They made special, this was back in the 70s, Night Train Lane. I can't remember who he played for, but he was like gruesome on the field when he tackled somebody. And they made the head tackle rule because of him. You couldn't head tackle because of Night Train Lane. And so things like that, just really get you pumping before a game. More commonly now we have, previews before movies. You've seen those? I kind of don't want to watch those anymore, because a lot of times it's pretty much just all the interesting things that happen in the movie, and you're like, well, I could have just watched the preview. It'd be fine. Last night we watched a murder thriller movie, and in the previews they showed you who the bad guy was. It's like, I kind of wanted to kind of figure that out, but they're gonna show you all this detail about stuff. So in this morning we're going to be doing some highlight reels through 2 Timothy and looking at some important things and support messages that I think will be encouraging to us as we go through these things and kind of tie it all together at the end. As Paul opens up this letter to Timothy, as far as when it was written, there's some discussion. Some people say, well, it was written in succession with 1 Timothy. Others are saying it was written later, that Paul did in fact actually get to go to Spain, and there was kind of a double imprisonment. So he was imprisoned initially, kind of under house arrest, as we see at the end of Acts, but he wanted to go to Spain. And so what we don't see, Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, possibly he went to Spain after getting out of prison in Rome, and then was put back in prison because the conditions we see in his, later on imprisonment were worse, more dire. And as you read kind of between the lines in 2 Timothy, he's basically saying goodbye in this letter, right? I'm ready at this point. And so things are more dire in this letter, and so it's written much, much later. And so as we open up this letter, he reminds Timothy to kindle afresh. And so he says in verse 5 of chapter 1, "For I'm mindful of the sincere faith which first dwelt in your mother Eunice, or in your grandmother Lois, and in your mother Eunice, and I'm sure is within you as well." And so this idea of this faith that dwelt in his grandmother, it was at home in his grandmother, it was natural in her heart and in her life. It's fitting that we start off this idea of Mother's Day talking about this passage and seeing this. It doesn't matter necessarily, as long as there's somebody in the family that continues that spark, continues that flame, it can be passed on. And we see that happening here. It was in his grandmother, was in his mother Eunice, and I'm sure is in you as well. And we see this faith that takes hold here. And we know the story about how he was kind of taken along in Acts chapter 16. We meet Timothy, and that's when he kind of begins to join Paul on his journeys. He had some life-changing experiences before he started that journey, his dad being a Greek, but he made those changes in order to be able to preach the gospel and do those things. And then he reminds them in verse 6. So we have his faith, the sincere faith that's within you in verse 5. And then in 6, he says, "Remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." And we see that the spiritual gift, he had some sort of spiritual gift that was given to him by Paul. We read about this in Acts chapter 8, verse 18, where spiritual gifts were given by laying on apostles' hands. And then again, Paul did this to others in Acts 19, verse 6. And so Paul indeed did have that ability to do those things. He says, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline," or self-control or self-discipline. So he's reminding him to kindle afresh. His faith possibly was waning. A lot's happened in his life. Things kind of come up, and I think sometimes we can relate to those things where we're going along and we're doing a thing, and then we just kind of get, and maybe not necessarily, things aren't necessarily bad. It's just we get in a rut in our faith. Has that happened? And we're going through the motions, and we just need to wake up, lift our heads up, and start working. Some of you talked about how you had to clear the ditches out before the water was starting. And I don't know if we used to do some of that, not miles like some of you guys are working, but a little bit, enough to know how you do it. And as a child, when you're supposed to be doing that, and you see this, it's like 100 yards, right? But for a child, that's 100 miles when you'd rather be doing something else. And you start in the ditch and you're clearing it out, and you're just looking at that section of the ditch. And you're looking and you're going, and every once in a while you need to lift your head up and look around and get perspective. And so sometimes in life we need to do the same things. Maybe we're doing good things and we're doing right things, but sometimes we need to lift our head up and remember and keep things in perspective. God did not give us a spirit of timidity or fear, but of power and love and discipline, and recognizing what God has done for us. Then he goes into this idea, therefore, because of these things, do not be ashamed. He mentions this concept several times in this first chapter. Do not be ashamed of himself, the testimony of him as being a prisoner and what he's doing, but join with me in suffering of the gospel. So he doubles down on this. Don't be ashamed of what's happening. It has never been popular to be imprisoned, and Paul here being imprisoned wrongfully is saying, don't be ashamed of these things. It's possible his father being a Greek, his father maybe not being somebody who was a believer, may have had a voice in his ear and saying, why are you following this guy who's in prison? He's doing all these kind of things. He's not an upstanding citizen, his father being Roman. And so maybe that's something he's hearing and saying, don't be ashamed of these things. Don't be ashamed of it. In verse 12, for this reason, I suffer these things, but I'm not ashamed, and I know. And so here is Paul saying, don't be ashamed to him, I'm not ashamed. And later on in verse 16, he talks about Onesiphorus. The Lord grant mercy to the house of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. And so we see this phrase over and over again repeated. It's possible that Timothy was dealing with some of this. Timothy's human. We read through Acts and we read through these accounts in the New Testament, and we see, we're ready to stamp like, super Christian on the chest of these people, but we forget they're human. They still deal with doubts, and they still deal with the very things that we struggle with. And it's possible in this situation, Tim being fearful or shameful of what's going on and the message was happening at that time. It was getting rough. It was getting really real. and maybe some things were happening, and he needed to understand that, hey, we need not to be ashamed. Paul says, this is why I'm not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. And thank you for reading that song. I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced of this very thing. I am convinced, convicted, nothing's changing, nothing's shaking me from this fact that he is able to guard or keep what I have entrusted to him. And what is that? What has Paul entrusted to him? His very life and his very soul. And God will keep both. And I know he will watch over me. And so Paul is trying to transmit to Timothy, this young man, Paul knowing, hey, I'm not bound long for this world. What does he want Timothy to know? Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid. Keep plugging along. Don't be ashamed of these things. Trust in the one who's got you. And he uses, chapter 2, this idea of a soldier. So the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men. Chapter 2, verse 2. Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. A soldier whose active service does not entangle himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. So he uses this Roman enlistment as an idea, concept here. He uses something that's very common, an athlete. If anyone competes as an athlete, he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules. I love rules. One of my things that I despise when we're playing sports is when somebody cheats. Right? And now I run a youth, there's a summer camp that we do a week, and we have tons of games and things that we make up. But in the back of my mind, I'm making these games up and stuff. I was like, how are they going to cheat? How are they going to cheat? Because somebody always cheats. You know what I'm talking about? And he's like, this game could be great if everybody was honest and everybody just did what they're supposed to do. But they're not going to, the little heathens. And so I got to think of a way that they're going to cheat, right? And so, you know, playing by the rules is important. And so as an athlete, you play by the rules. A hardworking farmer ought to be the first to receive the share of his crops. These are things that are just common sense things that we need to understand. And so he says, hey, keep going, keep doing what and remember these things. Consider what I say, verse 7, and the Lord will give you understanding in everything. And so he says, for this reason, verse 10, I endure all things for the sake of those who are chosen. I continue to endure. Verse 14, remind them of these things. Solemnly charge them in the presence of God. Do not wrangle about words. Did you know that they were going to have people come along that were just going to be stinkers and just fuss and fight and be issue-oriented about little things that didn't matter? We've evolved beyond that, right? We're no longer doing that, right? Okay. All right, so we know that still happens. He names names in verse 17 of those who we've read about earlier. He's mentioned these earlier, but now they're not doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. But what he reminds them of in verse 19 says, nevertheless, the firm foundation of God stands having this seal, the Lord knows those who are his. The Lord knows. There are days and things that are happening in our lives that nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows, nobody understands. Maybe nobody can understand, but the Lord knows those who are his. And that should be a comfort to us. That should be a comfort to Timothy. And so he goes on to talk about, and this is what I wanted to really preach about, but I just couldn't do it, but this idea of vessels of honor and dishonor. He says in verse 20, in a large house there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also vessels of wood and earthenware. Have you ever been into a house and you have the china cabinets? This is kind of going away. It's not as common anymore, but you had the china. My mom had special china that we never got, and you better not even touch it, right? It was for special guests, and it was for sure was never at the kids' table, right? When the family came over and everybody had the adult table and you had the kids' table. And so this was special stuff that was for sure never at the kids' table. It was a special china. We got old enough at some point where I think we were embarrassment to go out in public and eat. And so my parents started, there was 4 of us boys. And so my parents started doing once a month we'd have special meals where we would she would put the china out and it would be fancy, all the silverware, right, where it goes. We had to learn how to use it. And we did that for a little while until apparently we learned and we could be in public again. And so that's the fancy stuff. And then there's the everyday wear, your normal wear. And he says wood and earthenware, like your plastic cups you get from the stinker station or something like that. Those kind of things, just the everyday stuff that you might use when you're out mowing the lawn or something like that. Just the common stuff. There's a distinction here. And God makes a distinction. He says there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also vessels of wood, earthenware, some to honor and some to dishonor. In the temple service, they had special utensils and cups and things like that where they were only used in dedication to God. Only used for worship to God and to work in the temple. It was those utensils that were taken into captivity, and it was those utensils that they were in Babylon using when God wrote on the wall, "You've been weighed and found wanting," and they were not supposed to be using those things, those foreign entities. But nevertheless, there are things that are for honor and dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself, verse 21, from these things, the things that we're talking about earlier, about these 2 individuals who were practicing evil and wickedness, he says, if you practice these things or cleanse yourself from these things, he will be useful, a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. Do you have a favorite mug? Like your go-to coffee mug? I have a standard for favorite mugs. I'll use other mugs, but I like a 4-finger mug. Anybody in there on that one? Okay, there's those dainty 2 fingers with the pinky up kind of mugs and that kind of stuff. That's not really a mug, it's a cup, right? But when I want coffee, I want a 4-finger mug for coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. And so that's comfortable, right? That works, it's useful. And so God is saying, hey, if you cleanse yourself from wickedness And Paul's telling Timothy, if you cleanse yourself from wickedness, you don't act like those other guys, and you do what God asks you to do, you are going to be a vessel of honor. You are going to be God's go-to person for the work he has to do. You might have a go-to cup, a go-to vessel, maybe a go-to tool or something that you use as, man, this thing, when I use this, it always works. It always functions. If we want to be that in the hands of God, in the hands of the Master, then we need to make sure that we're cleansing ourselves and make sure we're ready to be that. Romans chapter 9, verse 21, Paul uses the analogy of the potter and the clay. And can the clay say to the Master, who are you, to fashion me in this way? Romans chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. And that's kind of a harking back from even that was used by the prophets as well. This concept, what can the clay can't say to the Master, why did you make me this way? We need to make sure that we are not being that kind of voice. God, why are you using me this way? Why are you doing this to me? Just be moldable. Be ready to be moldable and be used for God. There's an interesting thing with clay. How many of you guys worked with clay? Anybody done that? Clay, when it gets hard and hasn't been worked, is pretty useless. Right? You can't really do much with it. You have to break it down, throw it in water, and just tear it down completely, and then form it back up again. And when you can form it back up again, then it's useful. And especially when clay gets age on it, in certain, I think it's Japan, that they bury balls of clay for hundreds of years to be used later on. And a clay that's been sitting for a long time and prepped and ready to work it's like working with butter. It's awesome. But it's only when it's been prepped. And so when the clay is being broken down and being prepped for something and is fighting against the Master's hand, it's not going to be very useful. If you ever worked with any material, the lumber you get from Home Depot and Lowe's and those kind of places, it's like, are they purposely growing trees with as many knots in it as possible, right? And so, when it has those kind of defects in it, it's not as useful. And we need to make sure that we are doing all we can to be of pure heart. He says abstaining from useful lusts, but we can be a pure heart ready to be useful in the hand of the Master. He talks about making sure that we are leading repentance, leading to the knowledge of the truth. He uses this idea over and over again of truth in his teaching, and holding fast to a form or teaching, retaining the standard of sound words. This is back in chapter 1, verse 13. And again, this idea of knowledge of the truth in chapter 2, verse 25. This standard of sound words is basically this idea of having a print, something that is written down, and we lay over it and just copy and trace. Basically, with the truth, make sure you're coloring inside the lines. There's a lot of talk about thinking outside the box and doing something different. With the Bible, you don't really do that. All right? It's kind of there. Right? It's not something you think outside the box on. With the Bible, we need to make sure we're coloring inside the lines and doing it the way God wants us to do. Chapter 3, difficult times are going to come. It's going to get hard. And Hebrews chapter 13, verse 23, not sure the time frame on that, but Hebrews chapter 13, verse 23 tells us that Timothy was in prison and he was released at some point. And so Timothy understands this idea. He was with Paul in many different situations. In verse 10 of chapter 3, he says, "Now you followed my teaching, conduct, purpose, faith, patience, love, perseverance, persecutions, and suffering, such as happened to me at Antioch and Iconium and Lystra, and what persecutions I endured, and out of all of them the Lord rescued me." And so he says difficult times are going to come, and some of it's going to be the hand at certain individuals. In chapter 3, verse 8, he mentions, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so men also oppose the truth. Men depraved mind, reject in regard to the faith. If you do a Google search for these, or a Bible search for these names, you're not going to find them. They're not there. These two names come from the Talmudic tradition, or the oral tradition of the Jews, that these were the names of the magicians who opposed Moses. When Moses and Aaron, when they laid down the staff and it became a snake, and there were those who were there, according to Jewish tradition, they were the sons of Balaam, and they were the ones who were there, magicians, and they copied and did the same thing Moses did. And so in like manner, we have this idea, and that's in Exodus chapter 7, verse 11, where it took place. Again, they're not named, but according to oral traditions, these are their names. And so Paul is using a tradition or a mindset or a teaching that Timothy would have understood. And so he's saying these are those who are opposing Moses. They're the same but different. So their idea was, well, we did the same thing that Moses did, so we're just as good as Moses. And they're opposing Moses. Your God isn't anything because our God can do the same thing. And it's still a religious concept today in that, well, hey, we look just the same, so we got to be the same. Does that make sense? Have you seen a counterfeit of anything before? Do they look pretty close? Look pretty similar? The same or pretty close to the same doesn't mean it is the same. In the case of Jannes and Jambres, the origin was not from God. What they were doing was not from God. And so Paul was saying here to Timothy, hey, they're going to come along and they are rejected in regard to the faith, men who are depraved in mind and teaching other things, who say they're the same, but they're not the same. And they're opposing God. That's why he says, you followed my teaching, and this emphasis on the conduct of how we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to learn and how we're supposed to act as individuals. And so he says it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but things will turn around. In chapter 4, he urges him to continue to preach the word. He uses himself as an example as well. He charges him in chapter 4, verse 1, I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is the judge of the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word, be ready. What are you going to tell somebody as you're expiring and you want them to continue on? Keep preaching. It's going to get difficult. Keep sharing the message of the gospel. He says there will be many that turn their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. But you be sober in all things, verse 5, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I, Paul, now saying, he has fulfilled his ministry. I am ready, being poured out as a drink offering. And the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. And here's Timothy saying, or Paul saying to Timothy, I'm checking out. I'm blowing this popsicle stand. I'm gone. And it's your turn to kind of continue on in doing this. And it's the same message to us, that we need to keep doing these things as well. And he closes in verse 16, at my first offense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. That's a really fun place to be emotionally, right? Everybody wants to be there. Of course not, unless you're an introvert, maybe. Finally, all right? But mostly you don't want to be abandoned by those you trusted, those that you learned to love. You don't want to be abandoned by them. Nobody stood with me. At my first offense, nobody supported me. All deserted me. May not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. Do you think Timothy's going to find himself in a situation in the future where he has to stand with truth? He's doing what God wants him to do. These people who are teaching error and are going in a different direction are no longer standing for truth, and he's going to be standing alone from time to time. Do you think he's going to flash back to this message here with Paul? And remember, Paul said that the Lord stood with him. Do you think it's a message that we can have as well? We're going to be alone from time to time, even amongst our own family. Paul says, and wants us to be reassured, that the Lord stands with us. So highlight reel of 2 Timothy. Hold on to your faith. Hold on to what's been given to you. Don't let it go. Trust in God who will guard your soul. Do not be ashamed. Be a workman of honor, a vessel of honor. It's going to get hard, but keep on preaching. And the Lord knows, and he will stand with you and strengthen you. That's important. It's important for us to recognize that they were human. They dealt with the same situations that we continue to deal with today. As we maybe go in and out of struggling with our faith, or maybe we just need to lift our head up out of the ditch and pay attention to what's going on around us. But it's a message that continues to encourage and continues to help us down our path. If this morning you need the prayers of the congregation, hey, I need the encouragement. I've not been living the way I need to. Please pray for me. You can come forward or we can talk afterwards, whichever you prefer. Or if you're here this morning and haven't been baptized into the kingdom, that you are not yet in the kingdom of his dear Son, but want to be baptized in, believing that he is the Son of God, confessing his name before men, and you want to be a vessel of honor, you want to be that workman for God. Please come now as we stand and as we sing.